Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Data-Driven Real Estate Podcast, the podcast for real estate professionals dedicated to driving business success using data. I'm Sean O'Toole, and today we have with us Bruce Norris. Hi, Bruce.
Sean, how you doing?
I'm doing awesome. This is so awesome that the tables are finally turned. You've interviewed me and had me on your panels so many times over the last 10 years, and I've never had the chance to interview you. So I'm really excited about today.
Well, you and I have had so many individual conversations too. So yeah, I can't wait.
Yeah, no, this will be good. I actually wanted to start way back at the beginning and, how did you get your start? Because you really started off as a real estate investor, right? Today, you're a hard money lender. You're famous for your data-driven real estate reports, but you really got your start knocking on doors.
Yeah, I was just flipping houses. Various ways to do that. Started in about 1981, worked for a company for 3 months, and then did it on my own ever since. And I probably did it for almost 15 years. And about 10 years into it, I just had the feeling that I just knew the business really well, and there was no such thing as California real estate going in reverse. So I built 7 custom homes in Palm Springs right at the wrong time. And it took me about 2.5 years of getting that solved. And then Aaron graduated from high school, and I remember buying a Honda Civic. This is where the data started to get into my head. I buy a Honda Civic for $15,700, and the next day buy a house in Riverside, a 3-bedroom house for $13,300.
Wow.
Yeah, and it just, those numbers happening right next to each other. And I had just emerged, mentally from a market 5 years before that where real estate could do no wrong and everybody's house went through the roof. So that was the mindset until about 90 when it reversed. And then in 95, I'm buying a house for $13,000. To make it even more profound, it was a VA home that's on a VA list. And you don't even get to buy the house until it goes through the occupant group. So no one in existence wanted to buy the house. It was on the list for $15,000. And then it went to the investors, and I was literally the only bidder in the nation, and I got it for the maximum underbid. When you go to escrow and you're the only one in America that wants a house, you think about that.
Yeah, no kidding. Now, coming back to first getting started, right? I know we see folks all the time saying, hey, I want to get started. I want to get into real estate investing. And I know this is dialing the clock way back, but right, you didn't have, did you have a formal education in real estate or anything else? I mean, how did you make that very first step?
Someone that I knew said, you know what, you might be good at what I do. So he worked for a company that bought houses. And I thought, you know what, and it was really not even a formal introduction. I actually was told that to even apply for a job, I had to get a license. Well, back then you could accomplish it very easily. I took a 2-day Lumblow class, got my license, and went applied for the job in front of the owner, who was a 28-year-old, and that's about what I was. And the first question he asked me was, how long have you had your license? I said, 1 day. And he laughed at me. He's the largest home buyer in Orange County. And he laughed at me. He said, yeah, there's no place for an inexperienced agent. So that was supposed to be the end of the interview. But I was from sales, and I just thought, you know what? I'm not going to accept that in my head. That's not the answer that I want. And I said, well, let me ask you a question. I said, isn't the bottom line around here whether you can buy properties for a profit or not? He says, yeah. I said, you'll know in 30 days I can do that better than anybody you have. And, in a way, I guess I passed the first test of being a property buyer. I didn't take no as a final answer. And he says, okay, pal, you got it. So I didn't know anything. I knew nothing about real estate. I didn't know what a grant deed was. He had no training. I went into an office with 5 other buyers. He ran a full-page ad in the back of the Penny Saver all over Orange County and Riverside and San Bernardino. And when the phone rang the 6th time, it was all mine. Well, I still had a job. I was selling electrical stuff for the first 4 hours a day, came in at noon, and I had 30 days to prove myself. So you know what? I didn't even know what a foreclosure was. I didn't even know what escrow was. But what I did know, and I got pretty quickly the concept, was that he had cash and you had equity and his stuff's better than yours. And I could sell that proposition. And so in the first month, I literally bought 10 houses and made a year's worth of money in commission. And I did it the second and third month as well.
Now, you know, like I found my success in trustee sales, which you found success in later with your son, Greg. And I really liked trustee sales because it was I've always been a data-driven person.
Right.
And it was very analytical. And, you know, we can argue whether or not I'm a good people person. I would say that you know, was not as good at, I don't think I would have had your success back then, responding, you know, to answering those calls that came in. You know, so strong people skills, right? Would you say that was kind of the key to understanding that, or was there something more?
Yeah, there is
some other piece. Is it like understanding, reading the person and understanding their needs? What's kind of the key to being successful when you're taking those calls that, you know, we buy houses calls?
For me, you know, when I went on my own just 90 days after my first phone call to anybody, and I continued to buy houses on my own. And I thought the success that I had was because I was honestly listening to the person's situation and bombarding it with solutions that many times didn't have anything to do with me. So there were times I'd get calls and I go, okay, well, I don't think it's necessary for you to sell that house to an investor. Why don't you just list it with a realtor? And you know what I found out is that the person that was going to sell me the house, and this is an actual conversation. There was a home in Corona. The guy told me it's worth about 135. I owe 76 on it, and I just want to deed it to somebody. That was the real conversation. I said, why would you do that? Why don't you list it? He said, I don't list it. I said, why don't you rent it or rent for more than the payment? And I gave him a few more, and he goes, you know, you run an ad that you buy houses. Do you want to buy a house or not? I said, are you telling me that you're going to find somebody to deed the house to today? He said, yes. I said, okay. So I went over to see it. And when I'm talking to him, I said, I'm going to buy your house, but I'm completely confused about the why. Why is this important to you? Because I could tell when we signed the deal, his shoulders relaxed and the pressure of the world came off of him. I said, I don't understand that. What's the deal? He said, I've never owed money in my entire life. I have an income from a New York building. It's 10 grand. I don't need debt. I just don't want it. I said, okay. And I realized, okay, sort of like CarMax, it was run your house by me. Let me give you an all cash offer. You can say no. But I realized there were times that people wanted to say yes if you could give them a pretty good rationale for it. The hardest one I ever bought was a 7,000 square foot house in Orange County. And this guy was a hardcore business owner of like a call center that had 100 or 200 people that cold called. So he was the owner of that business. If you can imagine his mentality. So I came in with an offer at 65 cents on the dollar of a home in Orange County. He took it to his accountant. The accountant came back and said, yeah, don't do it. Well, he had explained to me a situation. I thought he should do it. So the next day I came back and I had a 9-page explanation of why he should do it. And when he saw me, he said, I told you I don't want to talk to you. I said, yeah, you told me that for all the wrong reasons. Sit down with me for 5 minutes and you'll make a better decision. And he did. Well, you know, when you're buying 700 grand of real estate, getting paid 3%, that's a 20 grand check. And for me, that was a big deal.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think, you know, getting back to why it works, I think you have to have a pretty big why. Why do I need to make this happen? And I did have that. I was a very motivated person. I saw a chance to get out from under, you know, making a living the normal way and, you know, living on 30 grand. You know, I honestly, before I got that job, I thought making $1,000 per year you were old was my goal. So I was 28 and I had
Every year you were old.
Yeah. So,
right, so if you're making $28,000 a year at 28.
I had just passed 30 and I thought, yeah, I've reached it, man. And then you made 30 grand the first month doing something different. And then
Right.
just went, holy cow, that is astonishing. And I just got jazzed about the potential.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was motivated.
Yeah. 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 For sure. When did you make the transition to hard money? Was it straight from buying houses to hard money, or was there something in between?
It was quite a long time because the Norris Group really didn't open for hard money till 90, maybe 97.
Okay.
It's quite a ways after that. And how that occurred is that I was really just working on my own, buying my 30, 40 houses a year out of my house office, going to auctions, going to HUD auctions, all that stuff. And there was somebody that wanted to promote my seminars, and she wanted to promote a boot camp. She says, you really do something very unusual. I could sell you an audience of 10 or 15 people out every month at $3,000 a piece. And she went after me for about a year on that. And I finally thought, okay, actually probably would work. So I decided on Sunday night after speaking in San Diego that I would find a commercial building. This is a true story. I look at Sunday night, I come home, open up the paper, and there's a commercial building that's got like a square box ad. It said value 300 grand for sale for 120. I said, okay, well, that's got my name on it. So
Yeah.
I called up, and the guy and a partner were splitting up. They owed 72 grand on a property, and they wanted to carry the paper at 4%. I said, why don't you guys take 10 grand and split it and forget it? And they did. So I bought it for 82 grand. And and it was only a 5-year-old building. And when I went to the bank, I wanted to purposely assume their loan because I wanted a relationship with the bank and get a credit line. And when the guy looked at the purchase prices, he says, is the building still there? I said, well, why do you ask that? He says, they paid 90 grand for the building lot. And I thought, well, that's good news. So I had myself a 5-year-old building, but I was only going to use it 3 days a month in the education space. And then but I had been borrowing a lot of money from Craig Hill, and I was their biggest customer. And I called him. I said, would you consider coming to work for me instead of where you are? And that's how it started. So for years, I was the biggest customer the Norris Group had on the lending side.
Yeah. 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 Right. Doing your own deals.
Yeah, that's how it started.
Wow. Okay. Now, and you mentioned there that you got recruited to do seminars. So was that the first time you started teaching and coaching, or were you doing that before?
I kind of did it. I forget what it was. There was a program where you could just go talk at night, and I like to teach. I started speaking at clubs a little bit, so I enjoyed it. And there was a lady that was actually pretty good at promoting, and I actually paid to go to her seminar so I could hand her mine.
Yeah.
And she took it and she called me back. She says, I've never seen anything this good in my life. She says, I can definitely promote you. And so that's how that started. And then she promoted the 1-day or 2-day seminar. And then she said, I could promote a boot camp for you. And that's kind of how it went. So in some ways it was very gradual. I did enjoy teaching, and I needed to get better at the speaking part of it. And I never intended to speak, to be honest with you, John. That is not, it was not in my head to do that. That came about very accidentally too. I did a trade. I couldn't get rid of some duplexes in Palm Springs. I traded for, I don't know, half a dozen mobile home lots in a park where you owned the lot. So I had to figure out how to sell the lots by putting a mobile home on it. So there was a club in Orange County, had a mobile home speaker that night. I mean, it's literally the day I decided I needed to get that. I talked to somebody and said, there's a talk about that in Orange County. So I went to hear it. Jack Fullerton was the club owner. Mm-hmm. And the first thing he said that night to his audience was, anybody that says they can flip houses for immediate profit in California is lying. And I thought, wow, that's what I do. So I thought I was going to help him by letting him know that it was possible. So, you know how they end at the end of the meeting, if there's one lingering person, that's usually going to be like problem.
Yeah.
Well, I was his problem. So I said, Jack, I just want you to know that what you said can't be done. I do all the time. And in the parking lot, and this is kind of funny because I had a brand new 1986 gold Mercedes 420 SEL, and he had a Ford Pinto, and he was worth probably 20 times what I was. But he just looked at that car and wrote me off. It's like, there's no way this guy is serious. So it irritated me. So I took 100 pictures of houses I had flipped with the numbers, put it in a package, and sent it to him, really just to say, you know, kiss my fanny. Calls me back and says, I've never seen anything like this. You can speak to my club. Like I was auditioning. I said, speak to your club. I don't want to speak to your club. And though he was persistent, so I went to speak to his club, and that was a big deal.
Yeah.
It changed. Who was in the audience also was a guy named A.D. Kessler, who owned Creative Real Estate Magazine. And he said, you know what you're doing? How about writing for my magazine? So it was crazy. That whirlwind got me into the education side, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed teaching. I really did.
And this was the late 90s. And so it was 1997, you wrote your first, I think it was your first report,
Yeah.
The California Comeback.
Yeah, that was January 97. Yeah.
And so here you're a guy flipping houses. You start a hard money business, mostly to help with your own house flipping business. How'd you make the jump to writing reports? And, you know, that report, you know, which really called the fact that the California real estate market was going to come back, followed by your report in 2006, end of 2006, right? Where you called the coming crash was, I mean, those two things really kind of, I think, when I meet a real estate investor in California, right, they've all heard of Bruce Norris, and they've all heard it because you made both those calls, and you did it in these big, meaty, full of data reports. You know, so here's a guy who's a people person, closing deals because he's a good listener, and you jump from that to writing these like in-depth industry reports. What prompted you to do that in 97?
Well, when Aaron graduated, in June of 95, and I bought that house for 13.3, I realized, okay, I've been doing real estate flipping for 15 years, and I have no idea what moves the market. Nothing. And I thought, well, somebody's probably figured this out. So I went to the library and I pulled up every article in every newspaper and magazine for 25 years and read it about price movement. So if there was just like you and I went back to the Library of Congress and spent a few days looking at interest rates, that's what I was looking at. I figured there's got to be somebody that predicted this stuff, and there wasn't. And I didn't know what I was even after. So when you're starting from scratch, you don't know what chart matters. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to try to figure out what makes prices move up and move and go backwards. And for the next 18 months, that's all I did was collect data. And it wasn't easy like now, where you punch in, okay, low, interest rate chart for the last 50 years, PDF. Bing. Well, I had to go literally to libraries and with a pad and write down every number when I found the data, and then make a chart of it. And then that took 18 months because I didn't know what I was looking for, and I didn't want to eliminate something that might have mattered. So consumer confidence, I had those charts. And when I finally went to Maui, I had all the charts. Now, you're coming from a computer background, will laugh, but this is the only way I knew how to do it, is I laid them on the floor, all these charts, and I had yardsticks, and we had boom and bust cycles already. And so I was able to move the pieces on the ground to see if I could see a sequence of events. And then if it replicated in both of the boom cycles and bust cycles, then I thought, okay, I'm happy. And that's what I look for. And so that was the first chart. Now what's interesting about a report that's, if it's timely, it's too early, right?
Right.
What good is writing a California crash in 2010? It's a little late. Thanks for the help.
Yeah, right.
So the mood of the participant in the audience is usually like the guy's got a hole in his head. Now, sometimes you're happy somebody's saying something positive, but when I was walking around in 06 saying California crash, that foreclosures are going to go up by thousands of percent. You could get hit by half in price. That was not a popular thing to say.
No.
And it was not even believable. So I debated, John Burns had me debate a couple years back to back. I think it was 05, 06 against, PhDs in economics. I've got a high school diploma and some street smarts. And, standing my ground saying, guys, when I come back here next year, you are not going to be happy. And so when that stuff happened, that was, but so they weren't in the mood to hear it, which is exactly kind of what you want. You want it to be before the event, but you have to be able to see charts that clearly tell you it's on its way. And so,
coming back to the data-driven side, right? High school diploma versus these PhDs, like, how did you even get to the point, charting and statistics, right? There's lies, there's damn lies, and there's statistics, right?
Yeah,
but having done a lot with statistics and data science myself over the years, right? It's pretty easy to go wrong. We've got one of the reasons I started this podcast is because I regularly see some really bad data in the market from big companies, even from folks who have PhDs who are putting up charts and don't really understand what it is that they're putting out there. How did you self-educate on that enough to be able to actually put all those charts together? It's one thing just to do the charts, and then to come to the conclusions is even harder. But like, what was your process there?
I think the process, first of all, it had purity to it. I didn't go into it with a conclusion in mind. That was probably the best favor I did for myself. I wanted to understand how it worked. So that was, and that, by the way, whenever I do a report, it's the same thing, because you and I have discussed things that you and I disagree with, that you're locked in, and we've been very kind to each other.
I'm rarely locked in.
Well, that's what you go always open to learn, especially if you respect the other person's processes and what you're kind of asking. When you disagree with me, I go, okay, well, Sean's an honorable guy. For him to land on a different square, I'm going to listen. It doesn't mean ultimately I'm going to disagree with my former conclusion, but it's always added another slice to what I consider. That's absolutely true. So for this, there was no blueprint. I didn't know what mattered. And so I literally started with those charts on the ground, finding the sequence that looked like it made sense. And to be honest with you, why I wrote the report had to do with my son and my dad. Yeah. Because I thought California was going to take a run, and my son got married at 18, my oldest son. I thought, man, if you own a home now, it's going to be a big deal because this is going to crank. And my dad, he didn't prepare for retirement really well. So if you owned an extra home, it'd make a big difference. That's why I wrote it. And sure enough, there was Michael Carney was a PhD at Cal Poly Pomona, and they had the best data going way back, maybe 40 years in the construction industry. As a thank you, I sent him a copy of my report because I had found a lot of data with his reports. And he looked at it and he called me up. He says, I really disagree with your conclusions. The cover said, California real estate come back. Yeah, California come back. Why prices will double in the next 8 years. So he disagreed with the conclusion, but he said, it's so well done. I'll let you speak to my group. Well, I didn't know who his group was. His group was every major builder in California, the presidents of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. I mean, everybody was in this audience. I'm up in San Francisco. Behind me, behind the speaking podium, is a 30-foot wall of glass looking out at the San Francisco bridge. And it's just like, oh my God, what am I doing?
What do I do?
And so, I'm telling him how I came to the conclusion. And so it kind of put a stake in the ground because there was media there and all that. But who was I to listen to? We probably sold, I don't know, 3 dozen reports or some ridiculous thing. It wasn't, but people remembered it.
Yeah, for sure.
In some odd way, they were just, I remember speaking in San Diego, and the club owner said, it was just good to hear somebody say something positive about real estate. So even if it was a bunch of baloney, it was better to hear something good. And then gradually it turned out to be true. and
Yeah.
gained momentum, and then went crazy. Um, the hardest part, and for most people, is they don't have the reverse direction. So that's what I love about what we've done is we're capable of saying, yes, prices are going to explode and they're going to recede.
Right. Right. No, you're the report in 2006
Yeah.
obviously
So
said,
so
"Hey guys, this market's not good, and it's time to get out." And that had to be especially hard in your business, right? Because you were basically telling people to stop doing business with you.
oh, not only that, I mean, we were, it saved, there was probably a lot of hard money loans businesses that didn't survive that because prices went down so hard on that type of inventory that we normally lend on. I mean, I was buying properties in Moreno Valley at 20% of former retail value. So if you have a
Yeah,
hard money loan at 65% of high value, holy
yeah.
cow, you'd
I
be,
had one in Stockton. I bought when I bought it. I thought I'd sell it for 315. I ended up selling it for 260, and 2 years later, it sold on the courthouse steps for 45.
there you go. Yeah.
I mean, that's that's a big hit.
Yeah. So we were aggressive in the sense that we called if somebody had a history of paying us all on time, when they got 30 days late, I called them. I
Yeah.
just said, do you still have a profit motive on this house? And they said, no, man, I'm just trying to get out. I said, okay, let's do it, man. I'll buy it. We auctioned it off. I take a 10 grand hit instead of a 100 grand hit.
Right.
And so, we chased it down really quickly because we could see it coming. And then, but when it really hit in Riverside, we were going down 3% a month
Yeah.
and we were still flipping houses. So we were projecting out, okay, change the retail price 20% out 6 months and you can figure out what you can sell it for.
So
So
you stayed transacting deals the whole way through.
yeah, we did. Now, this is also something that comes up when it's always good to be in the industry. That's the nice part about what we've done is it's mostly from personal experience and it's real time. So when I was selling houses, and this was one of the interviews we did on the radio show at the time, there was a gentleman named Magziares who was the president of the Appraisal Institute. And we were having a heck of a time getting something appraised because
Right.
let's say on that Moreno Valley house, okay, 365 was the number. 2 years later, I buy it at not the courthouse steps. That was an REO for 65 grand. Put 20 grand in it, put it up for sale for 120 or 125, have 25 offers in 2 days and appraises for 100.
Right.
Okay, well, wait a minute. 25 offers? And so that's why I interviewed him because he was of the opinion that the appraisal world was broken basically because of the fear of a second appraisal opinion being less than your original.
Right.
You could lose your job, you know?
That whole industry broke completely, and honestly, it should have. I think the fact that three morons were willing to overpay for a piece of property doesn't change the value of every piece of property in a town, right? Like that whole concept is just
I know
so.
you and I have always thought about there should be a fourth. Well, well, there is sort of a piece of it. You want something connected to the cap rate reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, income, median income for that area, right?
Yeah,
Especially for government-backed lending, right? Like I'm a free markets guy, so I think, private companies should be able to lend whatever ridiculous amounts they want to lend and 100% loan to value and whatever. But if the taxpayers are going to back the thing, I think the loan should be supported by area incomes, which is basically the economic strength of that area.
right. Yeah, we kind of left the building on that one for sure in 2005 for sure.
Yeah, yeah, no kidding. We definitely left that for sure. So, so cruising into what were the first things you saw? Coming back to this kind of data-driven thing. Were you just going in 2006 and saying, "Hey, it's time for another report"? Because you said you usually go into these things, you don't have a preconceived notion. So, what prompted you to start the report in 2006 that led to that big conclusion that the markets were in real trouble?
I know you're going to really love this. The affordability number got too low.
Yeah.
And so I do pay attention to that only because, again, I didn't go into any of these studies with the preconceived idea that that affordability number is of any importance. But when it's repetitively true, then I pay attention to it. So in 1980, affordability got at 17, 89, 17, 2005, 17. Then it got to 13 in 2006.
Uh,
And I realized something was going on, and I didn't even know how the lending world had changed, to be honest with you, Sean, because I hadn't gotten a loan in quite a long time. And so we interviewed a lender in front of the audience, and I said, stated income loans, where does the income number come from? And without batting an eye in front of hundreds of people, she said, oh, we just make it up. And I went, holy cow. This was the last question I asked her. I said, hey, thanks for the information. And I really thought about, wow, that is scary stuff. And so that was, but I knew we had written a report the year before, and it was sort of like a warning flashing saying you might want to get your stuff out of California. And then the crash was really when I looked at it and said, this is completely overdone. And I didn't even understand at the time what a collateralized debt obligation was. So that was really something I learned when my daughter got married, strangely enough. I was sent an insurance policy in case, what if your daughter's wedding doesn't come about? You can insure against its outcome by writing a $500 check and getting your 25 grand back. And then when I
oh,
filled out the application, it said, who are you? And I was the father of the bride, but then there was another box to check, and it was other. And I realized, holy cow, I get it. I could have an audience of 200 people and say, we're going to fill out this form. We're going to bet against the outcome of my daughter's wedding. And I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen.
hmm,
That's a little scary, but that's kind of what happened. You had companies in New York putting their clients in stuff that they were betting against themselves.
right,
And I
right.
figured that out. That was pretty scary.
Yeah, no, definitely pretty scary. And that didn't turn out well, for
Oh,
sure.
for really bad.
All right.
To be on the right side of that statistically, though, was really important because you didn't have too much chance to get out after it turned bad.
I mean, yes and no, though, right? Like, because, I mean, you came to I decided at the end of 2005, I didn't want to own any more real estate, right? You decided in 2006, yet middle of 2007, you still have Ben Bernanke saying, hey, this is a subprime crisis. It's largely contained. It's really nothing to worry about. House prices are going to be fine. You
See,
had
that's why
the
I like.
National Association of Realtors writing their book about,
That's
there's
right.
no bubble.
That's right.
So, I mean, uh, the thing I love about real estate is you actually have a lot of time, right? Like, usually if you're paying attention, you've got a year or more.
Well, you got to go back to think about why we had time, because it was all based on BS. See, that's why I like statistics, because you can make, I wouldn't mind making an early decision to avoid a 2008 crash.
Right.
So, no, I was already all sold by the time 2006. Whatever I wanted to sell in California was gone because I was worried in '05. So
Right.
that's why I like a data-driven approach, because it gives you a warning light where you can go, okay, I want to sell to a willing crowd. The last home I sold in California was in '05. This is a home I had only owned for a year. It got flipped to me by a friend. I promised to keep the tenant in there for a year. And then the day after a year, I said, I'm going to go ahead and list the house. Now, this was a crazy market in '05. I said, I'm going to pay for you guys to enjoy the day at Disneyland. I'm going to list it in the morning. I'm going to pull the listing at night. So it was basically a 10-hour listing that got 27 offers. That was the market. And I never painted the house.
Oh my gosh.
So when I want to sell something, I want to sell it to a crowd that's going to be there. Now the opposite of that, we were building a series of new homes in Rosamond. We got down, and the prices progressed from 210 to 285 with people camping out, the whole deal in Rosamond, which is kind of in the middle of nowhere. But the last phase, there were things that started to occur. This is probably late '05. and we had 2 escrows fall out at 285, and they ultimately sold at an auction for 205. It happened that fast.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure for I do remember for the builders, and this was one of the things, was a sign for me to get out was, you went from the builders having a line of people, out the door waiting for, new inventory to come online and people putting down deposits and the rest to, there was a builder in Stockton that started to offer a free swimming pool. Right? And it's like, okay, wait, something pretty seriously changed here.
Yep.
And and so I think there's plenty of those signs
That's
out there. But
bad.
I guess for them, it did happen quite fast.
Oh, it's because they don't rely on the data. They honestly don't. They rely on the physical evidence that they have is how many people showed up and willing to put something into escrow. But if at the time it changes, that whole world can change in 60
It's too
days.
late.
You can't change your building model. You're tied up land at the highest price and you're stuck with it. You're going to lose it. That's a bad way to operate as a builder, but that's, somebody told me that, okay, even if you are exactly right, there would be no way for me to be able to tell that to a builder right now. I'd be fired. They would find a consultant that would tell them what they wanted to hear.
Yeah, right. And yeah, right. I agree. And probably some of them certainly took a lot of personal risk, and others probably weren't that much on the hook. Right? It was banks and others that were on the hook.
Sure.
So they were better off to keep the facade going than to acknowledge it because their income stopped when they stopped, and they didn't really personally have the risk.
I can understand that completely. Can you imagine having a big company with 100 employees in 2006 when it's booming like crazy? You have a company meeting and say, hey guys, we're going to shut it down for 2 years, get to the sideline, buy the stuff for 10 cents on the dollar, and I'll rehire you in a couple of years. How do you have that conversation?
Right.
That's tough.
Yeah. No, and the bank's probably calling you saying, hey, we'd really like to do another deal. We'd like to give you more money. You guys are such a successful operator, right? So even the banks are making that mistake and pushing you that direction.
Yeah, they use the same charts apparently.
Yeah, no doubt.
If you use how you feel, that's really the secret is I have to divorce myself from how I feel because I feel like everyone else.
Right.
The charts
Right.
speak to me and tell me this is locked and loaded, and in the past has been a certainty that this is what unfolds, and I've come to believe that.
No, my partners and some of my vendors and the rest all thought I was crazy at the end of 2005 when I said I'm done.
Yeah.
I'm not buying anything else. And they said, this is the greatest market ever. Like, how could you possibly get out? And I probably got out a little early, 6 months or so. Definitely some guys made some more money, but most of those guys that made some more money also lost a bunch because they didn't stop.
Yeah. Well, Warren Buffett has a theory about that. It's always best to sell early. He's a pretty smart guy.
Yeah, for sure. Out of all this, you came up with a quadrant system. In kind of your market cycles, market timing. I don't know that I've fully bought into the whole kind of market timing and that there's these different quadrants.
Okay.
But so can you give us an overview of that? And
well, I'll even use years that we're really familiar with.
Okay.
So let's say in 2008, it hit the fan. That's quadrant 2. Prices are now descending.
Okay.
If I think it's a rational decision to say that California is going to build a house again someday, I'm going to look for deals in 2 major spots. I'm going to look at inventory that's coming from lenders that could be heavily discounted, either by REO sales or opening bids at trustee sale or even short sales. But if I was a land person, I'd go after dirt because you're the only buyer in the world. And that's what quadrant 2 would tell me as to what inventory to go after that I literally might be able to buy for nothing.
Okay. Because there's nobody interested in that. In that particular set of circumstances, there's nobody that's a buyer. kind of back to your $13,000 house, you were the only person in the nation that wanted to buy that house.
Right. So just to give you an example, Doug Duncan, chief economist of Fannie Mae, I'm going to do an interview with him first quarter of 2015. To prepare for that, I studied their last quarter 2014 financials. In that, it said 25% of all of Fannie Mae's losses come from one state, Florida. And I thought, holy cow, that's a pretty big number. I looked at why that was, and they had a 4-year foreclosure process. They were in 2011. In 2015, I called up my buddy Alex. I said, poke around and let's buy the remaining lots of a building tract that failed. And it took him a day because we were the only taker.
Right.
And that's where my rentals are. So
Okay.
yeah, that quadrant tells me now. So the skill level, think about the skill level that you're talking about. What would you do at trustee sales? If that was your only skill right now, what would you do?
In that particular market?
No, right now.
Oh, right now. Yeah, there's not really very many trustee sales at the moment. They are coming back a little bit.
Okay.
They had stopped because of the foreclosure moratorium, and but we are seeing some signs of life there. But yeah, for the last couple of months, right?
Well, not just
you're
a couple.
talking.
I mean, honestly, isn't like the last 5 years when you're in a bull market and you're in quadrant 4 running, there's other ways.
Yeah, but I did almost all my buying of trustee sales from 2002 to 2006.
That's interesting. Okay.
And there were more the last 5 years than there were 2002 to 2006.
Okay.
Right. So there were more competitors in the market, and that was partially my fault, but
yes.
but
that's funny you said that.
but there were more foreclosures. So you could still, it's tough. It was very competitive. The margins were small, but I made a nice living in a bull market in trustee sales. So
in a market,
certainly not in the foreclosures, in the moratoriums.
Let's say in the last 5 years, you would have been well served to be building spec homes.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, you get rewarded. So that's a quadrant 4 activity.
Okay.
Well, here's the idea. If all I know how to do is buy REOs,
right,
then I
in a specific quadrant.
I'm going to have some dead time in my career.
Right.
So I have to know how to talk to people. That's quadrant 4 activity.
Got it.
If a quadrant 2, bunch of REOs, I need to build relationship with people that control inventory. That's my skill.
Okay. So it's more about there's certain states of the market, right? It's not so much a timing cycle. This one happens, and then 6 months later this happens, and then 6 months later this happens. It's more like there's certain sets of conditions at which particular deals are more prevalent than other deals. Is that how you describe it?
Exactly. So let's say you have people skills and you can talk to people, and you want to call people that are in foreclosure in 2010. Well, at the end of the week, you're going to need therapy because you'll talk to, how many were there? Were there enough to talk to? Yeah. Anybody have equity? No. It's a completely worthless function. In quadrant 2, you don't call people in foreclosure.
Okay. I'm buying.
Okay.
It makes sense to me. So what especially in California, I think we're working on building a national audience. I think probably more of our listeners are California based. Where are we right now, right? Like I've been surprised and not surprised by some of the activity we've seen here as a result of COVID. What are your takes on the market, maybe nationally, and then maybe, I know you've paid a lot of attention to Florida, California, any of those that you want to speak to and where you think we're at?
Well, for somebody that pays attention to charts, to say that we're in uncharted territory is a pretty accurate statement. This reminds me a little bit of Grand Junction, Colorado, where the damage was caused by an industry leaving in a day and creating unemployment that was 25% for an area. So we really have a very strange market. I mean, I know you pay attention to the market. We all have contacts where I don't think too many people are having trouble selling inventory that they have, maybe even for more than they thought they would. So you have people pull inventory off. So you got a shortage of inventory. If you look at year over year volume, it's down by quite a bit, but there was a big hole for 2 months or something. So that's California's market. In Florida, we're building homes and we're selling them in a day.
Right.
And so I don't, here's the question. Are we going to have round 2 or round 3 of the coronavirus take employment to a number that's Great Depression levels? So that I don't know the answer to, and I think that's the important answer. The foreclosure numbers to me matter, but I don't think there's any appetite to foreclose on people that lost their job. There'll be policies that prevent that by and large, I think.
I agree.
Yeah, so you're not going to have this avalanche of chart going crazy in foreclosures.
You would certainly, I think we're going to certainly see more, but I don't think we're going to see a repeat of 2008.
Correct. So I think real estate, especially, you and I had, remember, I'll always remember that email where I emailed you my idea that someday when we had a recession, the next recession, we'd see a mortgage rate start with a 2.
Right.
Your response to me was, I think you're right. And
Yeah.
I respect that. So you were speaking in front of audiences, and I was speaking in front of audiences about something that literally had never happened.
Right.
And we knew it hadn't happened because you and I went back to Washington, D.C. for a few days and pulled up
Looked at interest rates back into the
100+
Mesopotamia. Yeah.
So, I mean, who would do that? But that was fun.
That was a great trip.
It was.
And it was interesting to me, and it was great when I got that email because, it was such kind of a radical thought that, okay, when we hit the next bit of trouble, interest rates are probably going to go into the 2s, right? That was a radical thought at the time. And I had bounced it off some folks and they kind of thought I was crazy. And when you came to the same conclusion, it was such a relief, right? Like when I got that email, I remember hopping on the phone and going, "Oh my God, you think that too?" It was great.
Like you, I was going to say it anyway because it's where I had landed.
Right. Exactly.
It didn't mean there was a historic precedence for it because there wasn't.
Right.
We're looking at the tea leaves going, okay, well, where are we going to go?
And it is interesting. It's interesting. I've been following that here, and I thought we would get there faster. And
I did too.
The independent mortgage banks and the trouble they had around their business model with how they use the repo market and, how they use their servicing rights to fund the pool, to buy more, to sell, and just kind of how tenuous that is, and that they have to forward the payment even if they don't receive it.
Yeah, I didn't know.
Right?
Yeah.
That was news to me, and it was it's surprising, like as much as I've dug into this over the last years, or you have, that there's still things like that are like kind of like shockingly surprising, right? That a servicer who's collecting money and forwarding it on, to the ultimate lender has to forward the money even if they don't receive the payment. Like, who came up with that? Like, what a crappy idea that was.
Guarantor seat. I like that.
Yeah.
My loan.
Yeah. I don't see how they ended up in that business. Like, that's not a business I would go into. Like I got to forward it even if I don't receive it. Like, no.
Well, if you think about that, I don't know what percentage they charge of servicing, but let's say it's 3% or something like that. That means if they get 3% delinquent, they're 100% down.
Right. Yeah.
Revenue.
Yeah. That's
a crazy risk.
Yeah. Especially when a state comes in and says, "Oh, by the way, we're going to have forbearance and moratorium." And, and by the way, independent mortgage bank, we're not going to help you with that. That's on you. Like, right. What? Yeah. Like, that doesn't even make sense to me. So, I think some of that kept rates, and probably are still keeping rates from being as low maybe as they should be right now. I mean, I think we just set a new record low in the last it was yesterday or something. But
the spread though is big from 10-year to the mortgage is typically 2% to 1.75, and if that was true, you'd be at 2.5 without batting an eye.
Right. And the other thing that was surprising to me, because I keep looking at kind of where we're at with this increasing debt. I'm finding the best analog to be Japan.
Yeah.
And Japan's mortgage rate starts with a number in the 1. right? And so when I found that out, that was the thing that solidified that idea for me that it could be in the twos here in our next, downturn. And I don't think we're all the way there yet, but I still think we're likely, I think we're still headed in that direction, because at least for now, we're talking about maybe another bailout and the rest, and putting that much more debt out there. You kind of have to force rates lower.
I think, well, and see, this is the thing, is that we didn't have a strong enough economy to make the spread to where we could get to a 4 or 5% rate. And I think that was in your mind and mine, is how do you get back to normal before you need to take it away? And we never got to anywhere close to normal. And if your spread of taking away is usually 4 or 4.5%, and you start at 2, that's a problem. And so,
Yeah.
so you end up going to other types of policies quicker. You can't just reduce interest rates. You have to start writing checks, and you have to come, with all these programs that increases the debt. So yeah, if you start having high interest rates attached to ultimately, what we put on that cover at the end of a decade of 40 trillion, if that's attached to a 5% mortgage rate, that's a problem, or 5% rate. So
Right.
it makes sense. It almost none of it makes sense where you start looking at the numbers and go, okay, is this ever going to get paid? That's tongue in cheek. I don't know if you remember this, but when we had the September meeting, I survived. There was negative interest rates in mortgages in one foreign country. And I said, so hypothetically, let's do this. Let's write a 50-year minus 2% loan, and it can make a credit every year. And in 50 years, we'll have no debt.
Right.
That seems pretty simple. But
It seems pretty simple.
negative,
Negative interest rates. If we're going to go there, yeah, just make them so they pay themselves off with
right.
negativity.
Yeah, you can borrow all you want. Yeah. How did
Well, that's modern monetary theory, right? To some degree, right? Like, to the degree that we don't have inflation, there's no reason not to print money, and we should print money up until the point we achieve the inflation goals that we want to have, right?
Well, see,
As a
that's what's
society.
interesting, is most of what we're trying to accomplish is to get out of what I think is a deflationary environment and a GDP that's above zero. So,
Right.
we're not trying to, we're bumping up against 2%. We're not.
Yeah, no, and that's, I think, one of the things that a lot of people misunderstand about, when you print money, we all say, oh, print money, that's inflationary, right? That's kind of what we've heard, what we've been taught. But when you have this amount of deflation going on, right, from COVID and unemployment and the rest, you print that money and you're really just reflating, or getting it back to kind of the level. We're not really, but I don't think with the stimulus we've seen so far, we don't really have any risk of inflation. I think
Oh,
it's
well,
possible they could overstimulate to the point where we get inflation, but I don't think we're close.
okay. Well, there's two things. Just let's bat this around a little bit. As far as the population of Japan, that was very deflationary, correct? As far as the makeup of their population, we're not quite as exaggerated, but our population is more
Aging.
deflationary than inflationary. But the side of the world that you're very familiar with is all the technology, the robotics and all that. That's pretty deflationary. And I always enjoyed our rides to the Nixon Library, because every year you'd come up with a zinger, like self-driving cars that I laughed at, and now it's very much a reality. But you said one time, America's got to figure out how to have society when 40% of the people don't need to work.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I still believe that.
I know.
Yeah. We just saw Dorsey, I guess, just is doing a basic income experiment too, or just Jack Dorsey, founder of Twitter. I think it was him that just said he was funding a basic income experiment. And I think a lot of us in tech, think that it's going to take something along those lines, right? And I think we have to think about, like, so many people find their personal value in the work that they do, right?
Right.
The value that they bring to society and the value that other brings to society. Like, that's just kind of the lens we use to value or judge people. And, in when we reach a point where we really don't need everybody to work, which, is technically very feasible, right? Like, I see that future easily. um, where do you find that self-worth and value? And I think that's something we're going to have to confront for sure.
That's a little scary. You get so efficient, we don't need 40% of our workers. That's just that's an
Yeah,
astonishing thing. And yeah, you
Soylent Green, right?
that's right. Yeah, you don't want to get up in the morning and go, I mean, I don't think most people would go, okay, well, I get a check today. I'm good. I just don't think that would be a very satisfactory existence.
But I think that uh, like I think there's a lot of places that we can generate value that isn't like handing stuff across a counter. That isn't, I think there's a lot of jobs today, and jobs are still important, right? And that's where we're at. But there's a lot of jobs today that, you know, those folks could probably bring more value to society doing other things, right?
Well,
So
I think some really smart people, you being one of them, ought to have a group meeting and figure out what
we better get on that. Yeah.
to get on that one. Yeah.
Better get on that. Well, that's an interesting note to close on, but we are coming up on the hour. I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to touch base on or bring up that I haven't asked.
Let me just ask one thing, because the mortgage money was the problem before. Do you see the corporate debt in the CLO world causing a problem this time?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Like you look at some of these valuations, 30 times, 50 times earnings, and like the tech sector especially, and it's just like, what madness is this, right? Um, and you have the Fed buying corporate debt for the
Yeah,
first time, right? So they're
right.
propping that market up.
That's right.
I guess my big picture takeaway is that we are long past living in a free market or open markets or even a capitalistic, you know, I mean, it's still capitalistic, but it's not true capitalism that's going on right now, right? The the government is picking winners and losers, right? By buying corporate debt, by even buying mortgage-backed securities, right? They're propping up the real estate industry, they're propping up real estate prices. By not having foreclosures, they're going to keep real estate prices inflated. But these are policy choices, right? Um, so I think in my mind, this idea that there are uh, free markets is dead in my mind, right? So it's important to look at where stimulus is coming from, where it can come from in the future, and how far that will go. And I personally think it will go quite far. So no, I'm not worried about corporate debt.
They'll just write a check and solve it. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's going to be winners and losers, right? So there will be companies that they let fail and make an example of, and there'll be others bail out. It probably comes down to, you know, the value that company, perceived value that company provides to society and its importance. It's kind of like, why we didn't bail out the Weimar Republic, after World War One, and why we, have continued to support Japan despite having, terrible debt to GDP for the last 40 years. Right? Just picking winners and losers.
Okay. Well, that was my big question.
That's my take on it. What's yours?
I think I agree with you. I think they're going to write a check big enough to where they solve it because they can't afford not to.
Yeah.
That's the problem, is that like another Lehman in that world that's a big number.
Yeah.
I just read a report before getting on this with you, and I forget where it was, but it was talking about Wells Fargo. Well, off the books, Wells Fargo has $1 trillion of like debt that doesn't count on their books. You go, what?
What?
$1 trillion?
$1 trillion? Just a little number.
Yeah. You talk. Okay. Well, so I guess you're right until you're not, or is it just like you say, modern monetary policy just takes it to never land?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you can continue to print money up until you start having serious inflation, right? So, and that's kind of what modern monetary theory says, right? Is that so long as it's not inflation, you can. But and then once you start having, and I won't pretend to be an expert on MMT, but once you start having an inflation, then you bring in taxes to bring that back under control. So, but I think bigger picture, right? It's more kind of fall of empires kind of stuff, right? The, you know, us replacing Britain, or before that Denmark, and before
Right.
that China, right? Like, I think at some point, and this is, I think, where we were actually very lucky that COVID was a worldwide phenomena, and that all governments are having to stimulate, and all governments are kind of in this same boat. Is because if it was just us being the world's reserve currency and we started printing alone uh, too significantly, right? That could have led to the end of, the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. And I think that's when it's a very, very different game. Is that, is that the next black swan, or the one after, or the one after?
You
A
read,
little hard to say, but the trend right now is not good, right? So our economy versus China's economy, China looks like, they could be the next world um, leader if we don't change course and make some, make some improvements. So I think that's where it ends, right? Is a shift in global leadership, and uh, countries, Denmark and other places that were, um, global leaders in the past. And it's not like they're
they're not gone.
over. They're not gone. They're,
Right.
people are still there and doing their thing. And I
Have
don't
you
think it's
read?
the end of the world, but
Have
it'll
you
be a
read?
change.
Have you read Ray Dalio's material?
I've looked at that a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
It's
pretty.
definitely what he's calling for, right?
Yeah,
He's saying it's pretty soon. I don't know, I hope he's wrong about that, but he's saying
I think
it's kind of a 75-year cycle and we're 5 years away.
yeah, I think he thinks it's inevitable. I don't, the soon part, I guess, is will play it out, but inevitable because of he's such a history buff that when you're going back 500 years and you go, okay, yeah, that's what happens. So yeah, it's a scary
But
thought.
there's a very different thing in the world now, where the inevitable thing I don't buy into, right? Because when you do have good hindsight and you can learn from it, right? I don't know that, in Denmark, with the rise of Britain, like, they were looking back at, oh, okay, how did we take over from, what were the 10 leading indicators of why we took over from China, right? Like, I don't think they were thinking like that, right? Like, we have the ability to look at
Right.
all that data and think
That's right.
about that and go, what are these things that we have to do to make sure that we're a leader, right? And, yeah, anyways, well, I won't say what I was about to say. Um, I don't think we are on that path to remain a leader right now. And I'm not optimistic about the leadership of either party to put us on that path. But I think we need to get on that path and on it soon.
I will agree with that. Sean, thanks for taking time to do this. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. This was great. And our third edition of the Data Driven Real Estate Podcast. I'm glad we got into how you went from being a people person closing deals to being, really, the leading voice of certainly the California market for sure, and the industry with your, major reports that so perfectly called the market. So great talking with you, Bruce. Thanks so
Thank you.
much.
Thanks, Sean.
All right, take care.
Thanks so much for listening to the Data Driven Real Estate Podcast. Check out datadrivenrealestate.com to find show notes, be able to find links to the resources mentioned on the show, but also to ask questions of today's guest and possibly guests in the future. You'll be able to click over to community, and we'd love your input. While you're at your favorite place to listen to the podcast, please don't forget to like, favorite, subscribe, share. We'd love your support. Once again, datadrivenrealestate.com, and we'll see you next week.